Signal is regarded as being very, very secure. It has end-to-end encryption. It keeps very limited data around users, and it's rigorously tested. And many security experts see it as a go-to platform. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the ideal place to be transferring any kind of secrets. And of course, any platform is always going to have some kind of vulnerability potentially. With any of these public systems, of course, there's huge efforts to make them as secure as possible. And Signal stands out as one that is working extremely hard with end-to-end encryption and other measures it takes to ensure that any messages sent over its network are secure. But of course, if you are sending highly sensitive data, whether you're a business or a government organization, it's probably better to have greater control over the messaging system you're using. However, in the case of this Atlantic issue that we've seen, the challenge is very much more around a human failure than a technology failure. And this is typically often the case with security breaches. It's rarely the technology that lets people down. It's actually the decisions of the people using the technology that cause the problems. Any public messaging service, there can never be any complete certainty that someone cannot access the messages. Signal go to enormous lengths to make sure that their platform is as secure as possible. But in the end of the day, if you have something that's highly confidential that you don't want anybody else seeing, you need to make very, very careful decisions about how you're going to share that data.
Mr. President, your reaction to the story in The Atlantic that said that some of your top cabinet officials and aides had been discussing very sensitive material through Signal and included an Atlantic reporter for that. What is your response to that?
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it. You're saying that they had what?
They were using Signal to coordinate on sensitive materials and
having to do with what? Having to do with what? What were they talking about?
With the Houthis.
The Houthis? You mean the attack on the Houthis? Right. Well, it couldn't have been very effective because the attack was very effective. I can tell you that. I don't know anything about it. You're telling me about it for the first time.
Over and over again, we see reports of these big security breaches, but often it's the case that it's a human error that's been involved. So in this case, it looks like a number was inadvertently added or maliciously added. We won't know. In the case of a lot of enterprise breaches, it's often a phishing attack where a human is targeted and that human vulnerability is exposed to get access to data. So typically, any of these messaging platforms will go to enormous lengths with encryption, careful storage of data or no storage of data at all, catch all kind of safety mechanisms to try and prevent any challenges if there's an oversight, but it's the human that's typically the weakest link. In the end of the day, governments, companies have to make decisions about the best way to communicate. There's always going to be some margin of risk in any way that you communicate, but a communications platform where you have total control over it, as we see deployed in many military organizations, for example, is probably the best way forward. But in this case, it's just an example of where human error has resulted in messages being shared to people they shouldn't have gone to, and that really was nothing to do with the technology.
On this text chain, conversations went at length about imminent military operations, including specific targets, weapons, and attack plans. These text messages very likely included classified U.S. intelligence. And the entire time, nobody seemed to realize that a private citizen without security clearance had access to this conversation. Mr. President, this is one of the most stunning breaches of military intelligence I have read about in a very, very long time.
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again, to include the hoaxes of Russia, or the fine people on both sides hoax, or suckers and losers hoax. So this is the guy that peddles in garbage. This is what he does. President Trump said, no more. We will reestablish deterrence. We will open freedom of navigation, and we will ultimately decimate the Houthis, which is exactly what we're doing as we speak from the beginning, overwhelmingly.
Why were those details shared on Signal, and how did you learn that a journalist was privy to the targets, the types of weapons used?
I've heard I was characterized. Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's it.